My guest today is Dr. Jeannie Constantinou. She's a lawyer, author, Bible scholar, retired professor with over 40 years experience teaching. She holds 5 degrees in theology, and on top of all of that, she's a presbytera, which in English is a priest's wife. Welcome, Dr. Jeannie.
Thank you, Andrew. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me. Of all those titles and accomplishments, is there one that is particularly special to you?
Well, obviously, being married, that's a very important thing. Being a mom, that's a very important thing. In terms of my, well, obviously the PhD, becoming Dr. Jeannie as opposed to, that was
Mhm.
also very important. But to tell you the truth, the most difficult thing is the one thing you didn't mention is my law degree. Passing the California bar was the most difficult thing. I
Yeah.
had to do that was, and you're an attorney, so you understand that, but you're kind of young. So the bar exam used to be 3 days and it was torture.
I'm
Studying
not
for
that
it,
young. I was the last class
no
to do the
kidding.
3-day one.
No kidding. Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
that's goodness.
So
We
I
know
did the
that's
last 3-day one, and then they switched it to 2. And I think
yeah.
they're keeping. I feel like they continuously lower the standard for entry.
Yeah, I
But
was
I
going to
don't.
say it was definitely weeded out a lot of people. I don't know why they changed it, but that's a little bit
Yeah.
off our topic, isn't it?
So is that of all of your kind of careers and things you've done, is that the only thing you would consider kind of secular?
Well, in college I had a job, at a sandwich place and things like that. Yeah. I didn't
Gotcha.
do anything else for work that I can think of. Oh, yeah. Well, I was always teaching. I did teach music to second through fifth graders, and I taught religion to seventh and eighth graders before law school. Then after that, I worked in the law. So for
Okay.
different places. Yeah.
Gotcha. But for a majority of your life, you've been dedicated to the church studies,
Yes,
teaching,
I was doing
scholarship.
that. Yeah, I was doing that even before because I was a theology major in college. And then I met my husband while I was in college. And once we got married and he was ordained, we began serving parishes. So I was
Mhm.
definitely doing that. Even I think before I met him, I think it was teaching Sunday school. And also, I was a youth advisor, youth director. So I was
Mhm.
very involved in the church even before we met, not surprisingly. So
Yeah.
yeah, that's I said definitely the majority of my career, if you call it. But it wasn't a paid career. I was just helping at the church and just reading on my own and getting degrees and things like that.
Yeah. A lot of people, I think, stop there, serving at church, maybe a bachelor's degree in something religion related, but you
Yes.
took it way, way beyond that. What sparked that kind of interest
Uh,
in you and desire
yes.
to just keep on going?
Well, I really focused a lot on scripture for my undergraduate degree. I took as many scripture classes as I could, and because we were serving parishes, we had Bible studies and retreats. I was really using that information a lot. And when we returned to San Diego, because Father served first in Sacramento, then in Camarillo, which is about an hour north of LA, for those who don't know. Ventura County was his next parish. And then when we returned to San Diego, they had a master's program at the University of San Diego, which I had attended as an undergrad. And I wasn't really intending to get another degree because I was already, working as a lawyer. But I found um, my bachelor's degree so useful. I
Mm,
thought I would just get the master's since I was there, and they gave me a scholarship. And they had a really nice program in that it was set up that the class met once a week from 4 to 7. So I could finish working during the day, go to class from 4 to 7, and still be at church for a meeting at night. So, and it was, it was just an MA. So it wasn't a very lengthy degree, or very demanding. But I just decided to do that. Then I had my son and I said, I'm done. I'm not going to do anything more. And I thought I was finished. But then we moved to the East Coast and my husband started nagging me to go further and to get a PhD. And I was really not interested at the time because I had a little baby. He was only a year old, and I hoped to have other children. So I didn't think I was going to do anything at that time. But he was very persistent. He really felt that I had talent. That's what he said. You have talent, and I don't want to see you waste it. And I thought, well, I'll wait a few years, but I didn't have any idea how much more study was involved for a PhD.
Yeah.
So once I realized that, after my son was a bit older, I didn't want to leave him in a daycare situation or anything like that. There was a lady we met at church who had a grandson that she was looking out for. So after my son was about 3 and old enough to talk and communicate with me if there was a problem, that was my concern. I would never want to put an infant in a situation where they couldn't speak, you know. So once he was 3, I started going to school part-time, and that's one reason why it took so long. And then I got a couple more degrees and finally the PhD. So I didn't really plan it that way.
Yeah.
And I wasn't saying, I want to go to school some more, even though I enjoyed it. It really, I just intended to help as much as I could with my husband and stay home and make stew. And, you know, it was New England. We were in New England by then.
Yeah.
And watch the snow fall. You know, I had these romantic notions that I would be cooking stew, you know, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it wasn't meant to be. I haven't made too many quilts.
Yeah. In my eyes, you're a trailblazer in many ways because
Thank
I
you.
don't know of many women who have rigorously kind of pursued theology and gotten so many degrees, and
Yeah, well,
at least in the Orthodox Church.
yeah.
Am I wrong to say that your husband encouraging you was maybe kind of like that would have been uncommon at the time
I think
to encourage a woman to pursue
yeah.
kind of her PhD in theology and
Well,
things like that?
I'm glad you asked the question. I mean, definitely there are more women now. There weren't a lot of women. As a matter of fact, at the time I was really focusing on scripture. I didn't know any other. I think a handful of Orthodox New Testament scholars, they were like on one hand, how many people you could count. Now, there were women who were maybe in church history or theology or something like this, but there weren't nearly as many women theologians as there are today. We have more of them now. I don't know about for New Testament, but was it unusual? I think so, because let's face it, there's a lot of demands on a priest, and he kind of needs his wife to support him to be home. But part of it, the reason why it was possible really was that I only ended up having one child, not by my choice, but I really wanted more, but they didn't come. So if I had more, I think it might have been kind of impossible. And because it's you have to be there for your kids, that they have to come first. And my husband was very understanding, very supportive. And I only took one semester full time and that semester was really hard. So if you can be a mom and a wife and go back to school, but you have to limit it to one course or maybe 2 courses, because not only do you need to study, but you become stressed and it's just not right for the family. So it's unusual, I think, more so because it's because he's Greek. And probably like the Egyptians, they, want their wife to be not necessarily just staying home, because I know that the Copts are are really achievers too, but it does take time away from the home and family, and it costs money. So I think what I get out of that, whether it's a man or a woman, whoever it is, when you choose somebody to be married to, that person should be someone who wants you to achieve your full potential. That doesn't mean that the marriage takes second place, but that person really sees your talents and wants to see you blossom, even if it's at the expense of spending time with them. And frankly, that's still happening now because I'm gone a lot. I'm gone at least half of the weekends out of the year, and I leave my husband by himself,
Yeah.
So it's a real sacrifice, but he is willing to do that. And when he wanted to leave to finish his PhD, I said, okay, let's go. I didn't want to ever hold him back, and
Yeah.
he never wanted to hold me back. And that takes a person who has a generous spirit and who really loves you. And
Right.
that's what I would encourage, whether it's a man or a woman, not somebody who's only thinking about themselves.
Do you think that advice is different if the application of your pursuits are different? Because
Oh,
you're pursuing something godly, obviously, and
yes. Yeah, well,
related to
it
the
kind of
church.
depends.
Hmm.
Well, let's say I had, because I got my law degree after I was married.
Hmm.
So that took a lot of time away from him. Also, that was even more demanding because that was full time. We didn't have any children at the time, but I was very talented as a lawyer. I was a very good lawyer, and I have a very good mind for the law. And he was 100% behind me on that also. So it was the people in the parishes that I was doing the Bible study for. They say, "Oh, we like Presbytera's Bible study." At first, it kind of hurt him because they said that they liked my Bible study more than his, although I thought his was better. They liked mine because I was taking a very historical kind of approach to it. They
Hmm.
found it very fascinating. Father was more about discussion, about the spiritual application. So at first, I think it kind of hurt his feelings, but later he kind of said, "Well, she's got something good to
Yeah.
offer." I think that applies. So, to answer your question, it applies regardless of what it is that you're doing, because everybody has talents in different areas. And between husband and wife, you want to be sure that there's a balance, that the family doesn't suffer because the wife or the husband is trying to improve themselves in this area, whatever it is. So there's a certain balance. And I tell women, I meet a lot of women who say, "I want to do what you do. I want to go back to school." And I say, you can do it all, but not all at the same time.
Hmm.
And so when my son was young, I didn't have a picture of him because he was always with me. I didn't carry a picture of him in my wallet, because he was always with me. And I wouldn't go anywhere unless I
Hmm.
could take him. So that's not, we can do a lot of things, but not all at the same time. Some
Yeah.
things we have to postpone until we're later. I didn't get my PhD until I was 50. So, I wasn't one of those 30-year-old, because I would have a different career. If I got a
Hmm.
PhD at age 30, I would have been producing many more books and things like that. But, you
Yeah.
know, so
Another angle of this that I'm interested in hearing your perspective on. Have you ever heard of Dr. Scott Barchi?
no.
Okay. He was a professor of mine when I was in undergrad. He taught early Christian history,
Mhm.
and he told me one time about one of his colleagues' daughters who applied for a teaching position at some seminary or theological school or something, and she was denied because she was a woman. Um,
Okay, when was this?
well, I was in his class, like, I don't know, this was like 8 years ago, or no,
Oh,
like
so
10
it
years
was
ago.
only,
But I don't remember what the school is, so I don't.
what the school was, because that happened to me once also.
Mhm.
But not at an Orthodox institution. It was when we lived in Camarillo, California, and I was interested in continuing to take some classes in theology. In that city, there's a Catholic seminary called St. John's. And I went there and asked if I could take classes, and they said no, they don't, because it was a Catholic seminary, it was full of men. And they said, only if you're a nun can you take classes here. And I said, well, I'm married, and I'm married to a priest, but they didn't care. So
Mm,
it's okay.
yeah.
Um, no, I
Other than
haven't heard
that,
of that, but I suppose if it's that kind of a very conservative Catholic seminary, they might say no. They probably still do in Camarillo. I
okay,
don't know. That was a long time ago.
yeah. But other than that experience in kind of your journey, you never felt uh, that you were
No,
treated different or discouraged because you were a woman?
no. I think what happens that's different. That was actually more of an issue when I was a lawyer.
Mm,
At that time that I became a lawyer in 1985, majority of lawyers were men, and there was a big disparity, and some of them didn't want to, see me at a deposition or something like that. They actually, a couple of some said, I don't think women should be lawyers. So, but not in theology. The issue in theology, if you go to study someplace other than an Orthodox school, will be that you're an Orthodox Christian. And that has become, there's more, I would say, discrimination in non-Orthodox schools against Orthodox students, especially if they want to do scripture studies. And I know that that's happened because I've heard about it and I've seen it. I've heard from professors. And one of my friends who's a Coptic nun applied. She was top student, of course. You Copts are always these outstanding students. She was a top student, a friend of mine at Harvard. And they didn't accept her because they said, well, what kind of dissertation could she write? In other words, she can't do objective historical research. She's going to be colored by this, like, I don't know what they thought she was going to write. She would have been excellent. So Harvard didn't, and I asked them because she told me she wasn't accepted. I went to the professor who was in charge of the little committee of professors for admittance. I think she was ahead of me in school, and I was thinking of applying myself. And they said, well, they actually told me, if you could imagine that. Well, we said, well, she's an Orthodox nun. What kind of? But I've had other people say that the Orthodox aren't capable of doing good scholarship, and that's because there are certain conclusions that we will not reach. Okay, so if I'm studying like the baptism of Jesus, I'm never going to say that he came to be baptized because he has sins. Okay, I'm never going to say that. So they consider that to be that you're that you're not being objective. So our faith is always going to affect how we interpret the Bible, and they don't believe that it should.
Yeah.
And
It's almost like you would be kind of boring because you wouldn't be coming up with anything novel.
well, they think that you have to be objective, and what they consider that to be is you remove any faith from as a part of the equation of your interpretation. And of course, they also don't respect the tradition of the church as being any kind of illumination or providing anything useful in your in your interpretation. Modern stuff is fine. So one of my friends who was also a Harvard student, and he got his PhD from Harvard, said that they like early church, but not past the 2nd century. He said he had to drag them kicking and screaming into the 3rd and 4th centuries. Okay, they consider that too late, So I applied to Harvard, and I got I think I could have been accepted because they knew me really well, and I wasn't a nun. That I might have been able to meet that hurdle, but in the meantime, I decided that to go someplace else. So I ended up going to Laval because Harvard was very inflexible in certain ways.
Has religious academia gone super woke as well? You've been around it for a while.
Ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous. It's very sad, very, very sad. So nowadays, it's hard to get a teaching position unless especially if you're a white male, you almost could forget about that. And even a female, they label you and being a traditional Christian, that's frowned upon. So it's really difficult. But some people are able to. I didn't have a problem while I was teaching at the university because my courses, I was just teaching Bible, really didn't involve those kinds of issues like transgender or things like this. So I didn't come under the radar, and I just didn't participate in a lot of the nonsense. But if I had been a tenured professor and they wanted me to head up some kind of a committee that promoted that, then that would have been an issue, but I wasn't, so I was spared from that.
How is your teaching in schools different than your teaching in the church?
Well, when it is going to be a little bit different, although it's largely the same. When I'm teaching at Holy Cross, which I did for a year at a Greek Orthodox school of theology, then I'm able to relate whatever the reading was to where that fits in our lectionary, and talk more about the theology that reflects in the church, or how it's reflected by the theology of the church more directly. If I'm at the Coptic School of Theology, which I was for several years, Acts, your lectionary is different than ours, so I can't make that. I can still talk about the theology of the church, how it relates to that gospel passage, but not, or the fathers, but not so much about the lectionary. At the university, most of the students were not Orthodox, and it was kind of pointless to explain how this relates to Orthodox theology or what the fathers said about it, because now I could say in the ancient church they were saying this and this and that, and I did that, but I didn't really reference specific fathers because it didn't mean anything to them.
Yeah.
You know, Saint Cyril of Alexandria said this, or Chrysostom said that. You know, I would be more generic, but definitely, even at the university, I taught from a perspective of faith, and not in a very, I don't know, was it overbearing way, but simply that they could tell that I was a person of faith. And I was enthusiastic about this subject, and I talked about it like it really mattered, and these things as though they were really true, as opposed to saying, oh, this is a myth, Jesus never healed anybody, you know, that kind of thing. There was plenty of that. Okay, I was the only person by the end, when I finally stopped teaching, which was just a couple of years ago, I was the only person who was saying, yeah, these things really happened. Jesus really rose from the dead, you know, that kind of a thing. But there was a lot of nonsense. There's a lot of garbage theology out there. And it's sad because now the person that they're hiring to replace me, there are going to be people who have this idea. And it's very sad because so many students really want to believe. This is what I was finding with my undergraduate students. They really want to have faith. And just by saying, yes, this is true, there's a lot to believe, there's a lot to support the fact that the Bible is true. You know, and you can be a person, they know I was a lawyer and everything, you can be an intelligent person and still believe in the Bible, that it's true. You can be a person of faith and be a scientist. And I was promoting that to give them the permission to be a person of faith. And unfortunately, it seems like even in theology departments, they're trying to destroy your faith, not, what can I say, support it. And I really shudder to think of all the souls that have been damaged by that sort of thing, you know?
Yeah.
So I stayed as long as I could. I did what I could, and then I had to, at some point, you have to stop, you know?
Right. Now, in terms of actually in the church, do you have a role there as well?
Well,
Teaching like Sunday school or how do
no,
you?
because for a couple of reasons. First of all, Father Costa is retired now. We don't
Okay.
have a parish. When I go to church, we have a little chapel and we liturgize at home some Sundays. When I go to church, I like to sing in the choir. I did that. I did Sunday school, Bible classes, retreats for a long time, but not currently. And also partly probably, first of all, because I like to be in the church. And the students are, at least where I go to, the Greek Orthodox church that I attend, they're in church for the most of the liturgy, but then they leave and they go to Sunday school. I don't think that I can really, that's the best use of my time at this point, because it's very basic. And a lot of people could do that level. I don't mean to sound like I'm superior to that or anything like that.
Right.
I did that for many years, but at this point, I'm traveling a lot and I'm writing, and my time is better spent producing materials or speaking to larger audiences. So I'm gone a lot. And frankly, that's why I retired from teaching at the university, because I really said, you know, I would have maybe 100 to 120 students a semester. And they were lovely students. I did have some devout Christians of various kinds, occasionally a Coptic Christian, occasionally an Orthodox Christian, occasionally devout Protestant or Catholic. So I did have some who really appreciated what I did, but the majority were just taking it to fulfill a requirement. So I said, what's the best use of my time to give to these, 5 or 6 students in the class that really loved it, or to write books and to travel and leave something behind for the majority of Orthodox who don't have a lot. We don't have a lot of materials in English, frankly, good ones. We don't.
Yeah, and certainly the books that you've written are unique. To segue into your book, what is, just to kind of close the loop on this topic, what is the Orthodox kind of mindset, understanding of the role of women in the church as teachers? Because some take St. Paul's admonition that women should stay silent in the church and go home and ask their husband questions. You don't strike me as that type. So,
No. And the question I would say, if there's an Orthodox person who says that, I would say, are you sure you're Orthodox? And they would say, why? I say, because aren't you supposed to read what the fathers say about that? You see, that idea that women are to stay silent is not patristic. That's coming from the Protestants. And there are some Protestant denominations. I've met women who came from those. There was one who told me that literally women were only allowed to teach other women. And if anyone walked in the room, even a boy, he had to take over the class. That was the rule. That's how ridiculous this is.
A 10-year-old boy would take over?
Yes. As opposed to a woman, my jaw dropped. But that's how extreme these fundamentalist Protestants can be about the role of women, because they believe they're upholding the Bible. So let's talk about that. When St. Paul says I do not allow a woman to speak in the church. Here's one of the things that differentiates the fathers and the Orthodox from the Protestants. Protestants will take one verse out of context and they build a whole theology around that one verse. The fathers didn't do that. The fathers were smart enough to understand the Bible and to interpret it in its context. So St. John Chrysostom says, is Paul saying that no woman can teach? No, he's not saying that, because earlier in chapter 11, that comes later. I think it's 1 Corinthians, I want to say 14, someplace where he says that. In chapters 11 and 12 is where he's really talking about the problems of worship in the Corinthian community, where people were not showing reverence. And this is where he talks about women covering their head when they prophesy. Well, if they're prophesying, that means they're speaking in church. And later in chapter 14, he talks about them speaking in tongues. So there he's talking about being reverent in church. This is Chrysostom's conclusion, not mine. That's Chrysostom, who's the greatest expositor of the scriptures the church has ever known. And so he says, St. Paul is saying that women should not carry on conversations in the church. He took it as normal talking. So if they have a question, they ask their husbands at home. In other words, rather than when there's a worship service going on and they're reading the scriptures, they don't say, what did he say? Okay. And let's carry on. Have you ever been at a dinner party where first the discussion is everybody's together having one discussion, then somebody breaks off, and before you know it, you have 2 or 3 or 4 different conversations around the table? That's what he's talking about. That's Chrysostom. Okay, so obviously he takes it from that and from the fact that St. Paul, so he considers the context and the historical context in which we know that St. Paul had female helpers, including Priscilla, who were teachers. So to say that women are never meant to teach in the church, and of course he also talks about, we also have the example of women teaching their husbands, the role reversal, including St. Gregory. St. Chrysostom doesn't talk about this, but Gregory the theologian's father, who was also named Gregory, became a bishop of the church, but he was a pagan when he and Gregory's mother got married. Okay? He was a pagan. It was Nona, Gregory the theologian's mother, who made him a Christian, and she was the one who instructed him in the faith, and later he would become a bishop. But she was the one who taught him. And so we have definitely there's no restriction on a woman, from teaching, period. And from preaching, actually, too. And here's why. Now, this, just to take a moment here. In the Catholic Church, this is not true. Women cannot preach in church ever in the Catholic Church, even if they're a theologian, and the priest is not. Because I had men in my classes who were already ordained as Catholic priests, and yet they didn't have a theology degree. And they might be completely uneducated, but as a priest, they were allowed to preach. We don't do that in Orthodoxy. I don't know about the Coptic tradition, but in the Greek church, if you do not have a theology degree, you don't preach. The priest does the services, but he doesn't preach if he doesn't know what he's talking about. Okay, and theology is much more than doing the services. So, in the
in the Coptic Church, they do not have to have a theology degree to give a homily or sermon or any of that stuff.
That might have been partly out of necessity. I don't know, but and also you have a different sort of system in how you have your ordained priests and then you send them for theology. That's a different system. But the point is that in the Orthodox Church, teaching, the sermon is a teaching function. It's not a sacerdotal function. It's not a priestly function. The Catholics reserve all the teaching to the priests because they consider the priests the successors of the apostles. We consider the bishop the successor to the apostles. And ultimately, it's the bishop's role to teach. But since we don't have a bishop in every parish, that responsibility is given to the priest. But if you have the permission of the priest and the permission of the bishop and a theological education, you can preach in the Orthodox Church as a woman. And there are women theologians, a lot of them, in Russia and Romania and Greece, and they do a lot of the teaching in theology schools and high schools, and I think they do preaching too, and they have television programs and things like this. So it's a wonderful thing that for us, what matters is whether or not you're qualified and whether you have the bishop's permission. And if you do, then not only you can teach, but you can preach in the church. So Chrysostom and the scriptures do not say that women cannot teach. That's number one. Now, there's another passage that they love to cite, and that is in 1 Timothy, in which St. Paul says, I do not permit a woman to have authentitia over a man. And that word is normally translated as authority. That's not the word for authority. And the word for authority is exousia. Now, that is a very special word. And it means the authority of a bishop. And Chrysostom says that she cannot preach with the authority over a man, basically from the Vima, as a bishop. That word is limited to people with absolute authority. That's used only for kings and bishops. So we don't have a word in English to reflect that. That's why it's usually translated as authority. They don't know how else to translate it. But Chrysostom, again, is the one who says that this does not forbid women from teaching, but only from the Vima, which is where is the place of the bishop. Okay? So there you go.
So do you think in the Coptic Church, and I'm sure you haven't studied this, that it's primarily cultural? Because I've never seen or heard of a woman giving a
homily,
a homily during the divine liturgy. Is that have you done that?
I have done that, but it's more common if I'm going to preach that they ask me to preach at the end, because I'll do whatever the priest says. And sometimes they've asked me to preach after the gospel, and I've done that. But usually after the gospel is reserved for the priest or the bishop. I was just at a church over the past weekend, and the bishop preached the sermon, and then I spoke after the divine liturgy. But I was still robed, and I was in the church, and I treated it like a sermon, and I've given sermons, okay? So in terms of the Coptic Church, there is a bit of a different tradition, and I think that I don't know that the Russians allow that. The Russians tend to be a bit more conservative, but to tell you the truth, the Russians are more influenced by the Catholic Church than the Greeks are. And I think the Copts are also, because the Russians were very close to France, and there was a lot of French influence. There's a lot of Catholic influence in Russian theology. And I'm not saying that because I'm a Greek. This was said by famous Russians like Florovsky and Shmemin. They called this the Western captivity of Russian theology. So the Russians tend to be much more conservative and much more restrictive of the roles of women in the church. And in that way, they tend to mirror the Catholics. And I do believe that that's an influence of Catholicism. So I don't know whether that's the case for the Coptic Church, but it would be good for the Coptic Church and for the Russian Orthodox. I'm hoping that the Russians will loosen up a little bit over time. It's good for us to give women the opportunity to be more visible in the church. The Russians, to my understanding, they don't even have women read the epistle, and that's ridiculous, if you ask me. Okay, that's just my opinion. Maybe I shouldn't say that out loud, but I do think women should be allowed to read the epistle. There's really no reason, but they don't allow that. And that's also, then the Catholics do, I was going to say, Catholics do have women readers, so I don't know. I'm not sure.
If a woman in the Coptic Church read any church reading, that'd be a scandal, I think.
Well, you know, maybe in time they will say, or maybe you'll just keep that as your tradition. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really matter so much. It's just that because we cannot become priests, it's good, or even deacons, you know. I don't really personally see the harm in that. And rather than creating, rather than saying, I don't really see the reason why they can't read. I don't really see it. It's not really a liturgical function. They're chanting. Aren't they singing in church? Aren't there choirs? Mm-hmm. Okay, if they sing, they should be able to read. Reading and chanting was the same thing. So as long as we have women singing in church, there's really no reason why they can't read the epistle. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I'm not advocating anything else. But anyhow, that's just.
I guess in our church, the only persons who should be reading are actual kind of the deacon rank. So.
Oh, well, do you have women deacons? In that, I know what you call a deacon is not what we call a deacon.
Yeah, we just have women chanters. We don't have like.
Do you? But your deacons, the deacons are those like what they call servants?
What do you mean by servants?
The deacons read the epistle. Deacons read the epistle. Deacons read the gospel for us.
To be honest, it's kind of we don't really abide by any of the rules. So it's, it could be a 10-year-old kid who's just a chanter reading. But
well, you see my point.
Yeah.
If you're going to have a 10-year-old boy, why not have a woman who could really read properly? Because when I'm not.
You're going to start problems, Jeannie.
I'm not trying to start a problem, but let me just explain to you. I understand this because when I was growing up in the Greek Orthodox Church, we didn't see women chanting, and we didn't see women reading the epistle either. Okay, so sometimes it just takes a little time. But I just want to say this about that. The ancient church did tonsure people. And I think it would be perfectly appropriate to tonsure a woman. That's up to the bishop to decide if they want to do that. I'm not advocating that. That's your guys' church and your tradition. But the epistle is important. And I don't like it. When I go to church, I've been to a lot of churches, and they would just hand the epistle off to an altar boy to read it, and he reads it too fast, and he can't be heard, and he doesn't really know what he's saying. And he doesn't print out Colossians, he says Colossians or something like that. Or they mispronounce words because it's a kid. To me, that's wrong, because you're not giving the proper respect to that scripture. So I actually was training readers in one of our parishes, and some of them were kids, but they knew how to read. And we practiced it. We actually had a Sunday school class for readers, and they came and they had a robe, and they knew when to begin, they knew how to begin, they knew where to face, they knew to be loud, They knew to pause if there was a disturbance. You see what I'm trying to say? There's an art to reading, and it's important. And if you just give it to somebody because he's a boy, to me, I'm sorry. I think that's disgraceful. So no offense to the cops, but
No,
think that.
we're in agreement there for sure. So for anyone who's listening, all of your responses
Yes, direct them
have
to me. I
yeah.
love the Copts. I have to say, I'm a big admirer of the Coptic Church. I think this is a really special church because it's a church that's really under persecution still today. You're really living to be a Christian in Egypt. It's really, I can't even imagine it. And I know a lot of people have suffered a lot for their faith, and you still have martyrs there. I mean, this is a very special thing. It's a true, is really living the true Christian life. So I'm not intending to be disrespectful or anything like that. And of course, I taught for the Coptic Orthodox School of Theology for a long time, and have a lot of respect for the Coptic tradition as an ancient church. I mean, I don't have any quarrels with that, but it is something that we maybe have a little bit farther along in recognizing the talents of women and what can be allowed for women to do, rather than discouraging them. It's good to allow them to blossom and study theology and perhaps do some reading and chant in church, if in the future the Coptic Church thinks that's, something acceptable.
Right. Thank you. And so all of your responses so far have been informed by not just the scriptures, you're drawing on St. John Chrysostom,
Yeah.
the early church experience, etc. And this is kind of the topic of your book, Thinking Orthodox, understanding and acquiring the Orthodox mind. Can you explain what that means, the Orthodox mind, and what Orthodox Phronema is, as you use that
Yes.
word in the book?
Okay. Yes. The Orthodox mind is the attitude that we have about the church and the teachings of the church. And what that is, to be perfectly clear, is that we believe that we should preserve apostolic tradition and teaching, that we don't change the church because we think it should be changed. And that's kind of funny, since I was just talking about women and what I think it should happen. But in the early church, we did have women teachers, okay? And women prophesizing and speaking in church. So I think I'm okay with there. Okay, but the point is that we think about our faith differently. We approach theology differently than Western Christians. Western Christians will analyze something and arrive at a rational explanation. They will arrive at a conclusion based on their own human reasoning. We don't do that. So if something is contrary to human reasoning, but it's what the church has always taught, then we say, well, we're going with what the church says. It doesn't matter whether or not I have a different opinion, or I think that my reasoning is better. We preserve the apostolic faith. That's the most important thing to us. And that's why sometimes it's very difficult for Orthodox Christians to explain themselves. They have, Protestants are talking and Catholics are talking, and they're saying, well, why do you do this? And we're like, well, that's tradition. But it's more than simply we love our tradition. It's because we believe that that's what Christ gave the apostles, and that's why we keep it. And sometimes we can't always articulate some rational reason for why. The female priesthood is a good example of that. Why shouldn't women be priests? Well, you could argue they're half of the population. They have grace. They are capable of doing ministerial work, as we see them doing lots of other things. If you take it on a purely rational basis, where people say, well, they couldn't have accepted women back in the times of Christ or whatever, they have all kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
There's really no rational reason why women can't be priests. There is one thing: the early church didn't have them. Okay, that's enough for me. I don't need a reason. I just trust that Christ knew what he was doing. He put the church in charge of these men. They preserved apostolic teaching, and for whatever reason, I think there are reasons for it, but I would be speculating. We don't know them. Okay.
Right.
And so that's reason enough.
Yeah.
So you have the papacy. Then let's take that. So the Catholics think, the Catholics don't understand us. They think, oh, the Orthodox are just stubborn. They know we're right, but they won't concede that we're right. Why do they think that they're right and we believe them? Because they give us all kinds of reasons. Matthew 16 and John 20 and and there's a kingdom and there has to be a king for the kingdom. They'll give you a whole list of reasons why there should be this monarchical papacy, and Jesus left the church, the whole church of the whole world, all Christians in charge of St. Peter. They'll give you all kinds of reasons. Those reasons mean nothing to me, because we know that the early church didn't have that kind of authority vested in the Bishop of Rome. We know that. So I don't care what reasons you give. I don't care if it's logical to you. What we go by is what the early church always said and believed. And this has been our salvation. Because you look at Western Christianity and it's a mess.
Yeah.
It's a total mess. Why? Because they have abandoned the apostolic faith. They don't no longer have the Phronema. So you as a lawyer, or me as a lawyer, somebody as an engineer or a doctor, we can be perfectly rational and critical in our thinking in every other sphere of life. But when it comes to the church, we abide by what the church says because we trust the church. We trust the church because we know that it has preserved the ancient apostolic faith. Why is it that the Coptic church has been separated from us longer than the Catholics have been separated from us? We have been in schism between us for at least 1,500 years. I don't really count the 451 because there was no schism for at least 100 years after that. I don't know if you're aware of that. But schism is when you have two bishops in the same city, right? So initially they tried to mend the disagreement, but then somebody ordained a non-Chalcedonian bishop in the same city as then there was a schism. So for 1,500 years we've been in schism. We've only been in schism with the Catholics, and maybe we could say that you've never been in schism with the Catholics, because although you're not in union with them, you never really had a falling out with the Catholic Church, right? So why is it that we are closer and actually practically identical than we are with the Catholics? Because the Catholics lost the apostolic phronema.
Yeah.
They started using human reasoning and started diverging in their opinions and their theology and their spirituality and everything else. Our monasticism is the same as your monasticism. Okay, our spirituality is the same. Our interpretation, the fathers, it's the same. Okay.
You attribute a lot of that to Augustine.
Yes,
Book,
everybody
right?
knows that that's Augustine. That the roots of the divergence is with the person of Augustine, who began to use human reasoning in theology. That came from Augustine, and then because he was so prominent in the West, everybody was reading him and following his model of argumentation for theology, and that took root in the West.
So what
That's
is the
really
role of
unfortunate.
reason and rational thinking
Well, we
in the
are.
Orthodox Phronema?
That's a good question. As you know, the fathers and the prayers of the church, at least in the Greek Orthodox Church, they call us the reason endowed sheep, right? We are supposed to use our qualities of reason. That is to think and understand and make decisions that are based on free will and not follow our animal instincts, okay? We do not use reason when it comes to arriving at theological conclusions. Okay, that's where we draw the line. Obviously, the fathers of the church were very rational, very intelligent. We're not opposed to the use of reasoning. But we don't arrive at conclusions that differ from or depart from the tradition of the church just because it makes sense to us. Okay, that's the difference. So that's what we mean. The fathers, the church has already decided all of the theology of the church. There's nothing new to be discovered. There's nothing new to be articulated. We know about Christ. We have the Trinity, the procession of the Holy Spirit, the Virgin Mary, Theotokos, and all that. There's really nothing new to articulate, theologically speaking. That's one reason why we haven't had an ecumenical council for a long time.
Yeah.
There's nothing to really resolve.
You share an interesting story in your book that I think highlights the point you made earlier about the Coptic Church being closer in terms of
Mhm,
Phronema to the Eastern
mhm.
Orthodox Church and the Catholics. You share a story about a baptism you went
Yes,
to,
yeah,
and there
I
was a
was,
Coptic woman there. Can you share
yeah,
that story and why that's relevant?
yes. Because, yes, I was a godmother at a baptism, and it was an adult baptism, so the woman being baptized was, fully grown and whatnot. And I brought the sheets and the towels and everything like this, and she had been chrismated and all the rest. And afterwards, we have these wet towels and sheets, and she said to me, the newly illumined, said to me, "What do I do with these?" And because this was in Somerville, Massachusetts, which is in the Boston area, I said, "Take it to the ocean and wash it out." Okay. And when my friend heard this, she was overjoyed. She said, "We are the same. We are the same. We're the same." Because we had this reverence for the sacrament of chrism that was still somehow probably on the sheets and towels. And you don't just throw that in the washing machine and have it go into the sewer. We go to a natural body of water and we wash it out. And that must be, I never asked any Copt if that's their
Mhm.
tradition, but since
No.
she heard that and responded with such enthusiasm, I'm assuming that that is your tradition.
Right.
Am I right about that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Living bodies of
So
water for sure.
if we still do that, and that's a little thing.
Hmm.
We've been separated 1,500 years. I can assure you the Catholics don't do that. Catholics, first of
No.
all, they baptize, they let deacons baptize babies. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know.
Deacons can
Wow.
marry people and baptize babies. A deacon is not a priest. A deacon has no ability to bless. They don't even, I'm sure when you do a baptism, you bless the water in the font,
Yeah.
right? The
Hmm.
priest has to do that. The person is immersed in holy water, not just any old water, in holy water. That requires a priest. They
Yeah.
don't even immerse, of course, they sprinkle. You know what I'm trying to say? So
Yeah.
look at the difference. Well, we're
Mhm.
so careful to preserve even these little things. You can be certain that we're preserving much bigger things.
You have this quote in your book. You say an invasion is taking place more serious than any invasion of migrants
Mhm.
streaming across borders. And you live in San Diego, so
Yes.
that's a strong statement.
And you're in where? LA?
I'm in LA. Yeah.
Okay, well they're all most of them are just passing through San Diego. They're going up to you there in LA.
Right.
But it's happening in Europe, right?
Hmm.
In Greece, they were having a lot of migration in Italy. So it wasn't just
Yeah.
a
But
California thing or US thing.
yeah, so but I think in this quote you're referencing the invasion of our minds being
That's
greater
right.
than with kind of
More serious.
media, news,
That's right.
music. Um,
The
with all
destruction
that
of
infiltration,
yes, yes.
do you worry that these even little minor traditions, such
Mhm.
as the baptism thing
That,
we just talked
yes,
about, are not going to be preserved? Because I don't know if the younger generations
right. I
care. I
think
mean,
not.
so do you worry the Orthodox Phronema is going to be like lost among
Yeah,
the younger generation?
yeah, I think it's incumbent upon us to teach this to our kids, and that's the parents' responsibility.
Hmm.
Um, I never really thought, I know that is an issue because especially because converts are coming to the church now, and you as cops, you're also seeing Western converts to your church,
Yeah.
right? So who's teaching them about these little things? For example, when I grew up, I knew not to ever cross my legs in church at the knee. We don't do that. Do you do that? Do you know that? Were you ever told not to cross your legs in church or to stand with your hands in your pockets in church?
I was never told that. No, I just
So do you ever notice? Just notice when you go to church, whether
yeah. I
our
mean, I don't do it, but I just no one taught me that.
well,
Yeah.
we were taught you don't cross
Hmm.
your legs in the knees because it shows an attitude of
Yeah.
casualness
Right.
before God. That's why you don't put your hands in your pockets in church.
Oh, I mean, my
Right?
don't get me wrong. My dad would give me
Well,
one
that's the
behind the
point.
ear if even if I was looking backwards during the divine
Oh,
liturgy.
well, there you
If I
go.
wasn't looking
There
towards
you
the
go.
east, towards the altar,
There you go.
um, yeah,
So the point is who's teaching people this, especially when
yeah,
they're converts. So I do think it's important that there these little things. It's not that it's the most important thing, but it's just it's part of our Orthodox shaping that we learn these things and we teach them to our kids and to tell them, when the anniversary of somebody's death, you make the memorial weed and you ask the priest to go to the cemetery to say a prayer at the grave. Is anybody doing that? Is anybody teaching that? I don't think so. So I am concerned about that. I'm hopeful
yeah,
that perhaps this is something that I think the converts in many ways may save us. Because once they're told what to do, they want to do it. And they're not apathetic. And they will probably start teaching these things to their kids.
yeah.
But
At least among the cradle Orthodox in the Coptic Church, because we're living in this Western society and going to school in the West,
yep,
everything has to be explained and there needs to be a reason for
yes,
everything. So to me, that seems like a conflict,
yep,
you know, and I think a lot of parents just don't have enough. They're not, they don't study this stuff. They were handed it down.
right,
But if
right.
you ask them, why can't I put my hands in my pocket in church, you know, or
Well,
why can't a woman, do this or that? I mean, they're not going to have real good reasons for it. And
I think that's probably true. And I'm sure if I asked my parents or my grandparents, they couldn't explain these things to me. They couldn't give me the reason. They just said, that's who we are, that's what we do. That's not a good answer. But in those days, uh, kids didn't expect. They just did what they were told. You're right, absolutely right, that we don't live in that kind of a culture. We don't want to do something unless we think there's a good reason for it. That's a Western phronema. One of the things that we could do ourselves when we have that temptation not to do something because we don't understand the reason for it is to stop ourselves and repent of that and say, this is what the church has handed down. Ask God to illuminate for us so that we can understand what the reason is for us. As adults, we can do that. When it comes to our kids, you can say to your kid, let's make a list of all the things we don't understand. And as we're going through our days, and put it on the refrigerator, and then we'll invite Father so and so to the house for dinner, and we'll ask him these questions, and we can learn something. Or you go to your parish Bible study, or you look it up. So there are ways to learn about these things that we didn't have before.
I like that.
One of the reasons that our grandparents, our ancestors were ignorant is because they were under persecution by the Muslims or by the Egyptians. They were just struggling to survive day to day. They didn't have access to this. Today we have access to all kinds of information. And our clergy, and you can say, so not in the case of the Copts, because sometimes you ordain a person and then you give them a theological education. The priest may not know the answers, but you could say, Father, we'd like you to come over. Do you think you could be prepared to answer these questions? At least give him a chance to be
Yeah,
prepared to say, where can I find out the answer to these questions? And then the parents are educated and the children are educated. But we
yeah,
have to make an effort. But we don't say, oh, well, I don't see the reason for it, so I'm not going to do it. That's Protestant.
yeah. So
That's
it's
totally Protestant.
yeah.
Yeah,
So it seems like a core part of proper Orthodox phronema has to be humility.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Number one. Absolutely number one.
Hmm.
And there, in the book, one of the early stories I tell is about this nun who did not understand what she read in the story of the life of a saint, thought this is impossible, this couldn't have happened. And she didn't know what to do with that information because she was a convert. And rather than saying, well, either this is a pious legend or I just have to accept it, she asked God to illuminate her, and he did. Okay. So this is the attitude that we need to have rather than just saying, oh, that's not possible. That's impossible. Or I'm not going to believe that. I can't do that.
Yeah.
We are supposed to try to become better, to become more faithful. That's how the saints became saints. Okay. Not by
Right.
rejecting, because the church has been, we're going to close with this because I'm going to have to go.
Sure.
The church has been around for a long time. So I just want to ask you, Do you remember when you were a kid and the kinds of thoughts you had, the kinds of ideas you had that you thought were brilliant and wonderful, and they were really dumb? Okay? Okay? You as a kid, we've all had those, we all remember some of the things we did, some of the things we thought that we thought was perfectly rational, and it is from your child's mind. The church is like your mother. Your mother's been around. Your mother would say, that's a bad idea. Your mother stopped you from disaster, or maybe she never found out the dumb thing you did. Your mother would have known better because she's been around for a while. She's
Yeah.
lived her life. She has experience. The church has been here for 2,000 years. It knows right from wrong. It knows what works. It knows, even if we don't know, why we do these things. The reasons why may be lost on us, but that doesn't mean there isn't a good reason. It just means we're not mature. We're babies. And this is part of our problem. You mentioned before humility, which is an excellent point. Because you're a lawyer, I'm a lawyer, this guy's a doctor, this guy's an engineer, this person's a pharmacist. We think we should be able to understand everything because we're accomplished and educated in our lives outside the church. But when we set foot in the church, we're like little babies. And we should listen and observe and learn. That's what we should be doing. That's the Orthodox Phronema. Okay.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, let's end on that. And thanks so much
It's
for
my
this
pleasure.
conversation.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful to spend some time with you and talk about these things. And I wish you all the best.
Thanks so much,
Thank
Doctor.
you.